Pam Bondi stood up, not as a politician, but as a woman fed up with the charade. The moment the accusations started flying in that congressional hearing room, it was clear this wasn't about law. Pam Bondi stood up, not as a politician, but as a woman fed up with the charade. The moment the accusations started flying in that congressional hearing room, it was clear this wasn't about law, order, or facts. It was a show, a production staged, for headlines, cameras, and a carefully curated outrage. From the opening remarks, it felt less like a serious deliberation and more like a scripted drama, where the outcome had already been decided behind closed doors. Bondi saw right through it. She didn't blink. She didn't pause. She let them. I know she wasn't going to sit quietly and allow justice to be distorted by a crowd obsessed with political vengeance. You could feel the tension in the room when she took a breath and leaned in. Every word she spoke came with weight, with intention. She wasn't there to play nice or appease the media. This wasn't a performance. It was a counterstrike. The entire chamber could feel it. When she opened her mouth, it wasn't just rebuttal. It was a full-scale takedown. She pointed out with unshakable calm that the entire display unfolding before them had nothing to do with due process. Instead, it was a blatant attempt to score political points. What we were watching, she said, wasn't justice in motion, it was revenge on parade. She began calling out the double standards, the shifting rules, and the calculated timing of it all. She reminded the room that investigations were meant to be impartial, led by evidence, not emotion. But what had unfolded here was a twisted mockery of justice. The facts hadn't changed, but the narrative sure had. And that narrative was carefully designed, not discovered. It wasn't about uncovering truth. It was about crafting a headline. She challenged them to show real proof, real criminal intent, real violations of law. Instead, all they had was innuendo wrapped in outrage, opinion disguised as evidence. Bondi didn't hold back. She called it what it was, a spectacle. She spoke about how these congressional proceedings had devolved into a circus, with members more concerned about going viral than getting to the bottom of anything meaningful. Every accusation was a soundbite, every statement a tweet. The rule of law was supposed to be blind, she said, but in this room it was blindfolded and gagged, forced to sit in the corner while political operatives performed for the cameras. Her voice rose, not in anger, but in urgency. She painted the picture of a country where justice is no longer sacred, where institutions are hijacked for power. The very foundation of the legal system is built on fairness, on the presumption of innocence, on the idea that everyone is treated equally. But what she was seeing in that moment was the complete opposite. There was no presumption of innocence. Here, the verdict had already been written before the hearing ever started. She stared down her critics and reminded them that when a justice system is used as a weapon against political opponents, the country loses more than just credibility. It loses its soul. She reminded the chamber that there was a time when Democrats and Republicans could agree on the sanctity of law, even if they disagreed on policy. But those days, she said, were gone. Replaced now by mobs with microphones and activists in suits. And that, more than anything, was why she refused to stay silent. Pam Bondi's tone never wavered. She knew exactly what she was doing. This was her warning shot. She wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how loud or self-righteous, rewrite the rules just to fit their narrative. She called out the hypocrisy with surgical precision. How one side demands transparency but hides facts. How they cry about democracy while staging coordinated smear campaigns. She was sick of it. She made it clear that integrity doesn't mean agreeing with one side. It means standing for the truth, even when it's unpopular. And she was ready to do just that, even if she had to do it alone. Every time someone tried to interrupt her, she doubled down. Every time the tone shifted to mockery, she reminded them this wasn't a joke. It was a country on the line. What they were doing, she said, was reckless, dangerous. Because when you turn justice into theater, you don't just hurt the accused, you damage the entire system. And once it's broken, it doesn't just affect one person, it affects everyone. She knew it, and deep down, so did they. Pam Bondi didn't come to that hearing to play defense. She came to deliver a message A warning, loud and clear, that what was unfolding inside those marble halls was not about one person. It was about a much bigger agenda, and if the American people didn't wake up, they'd soon find themselves on the receiving end of the same tactics. With every word she spoke, it became more obvious. This was no longer about one case, one hearing, or one politician. This was about control. This was about silencing voices that don't comply. The spotlight might be on a single target today, but tomorrow it could be anyone who dares to question the narrative. She leaned forward, eyes steady, her tone unwavering. The accusations being tossed around weren't just meant to tarnish a reputation, they were part of a calculated strategy. Pam laid it out plainly. This was a roadmap. Today, a political figure is in the crosshairs. Tomorrow, it could be a journalist, a faith leader, a business owner, or a parent speaking up at a school board meeting. What they were witnessing wasn't accountability. It was a warning shot to every American who refuses to bend a knee to the prevailing ideology. The tools being used weren't new, she said. They've been refined over time. Public shaming, legal intimidation, media saturation, selective leaks, and endless congressional hearings designed to bury opponents in accusation after accusation. None of it is about truth. It's about exhausting the opposition until they're too tired, too broke, or too scared to fight back. She pointed out that the playbook was being followed step by step: isolate, accuse, amplify, and destroy. And all of it was being done under the false pretense of justice. Pam didn't need to shout to make her point. She let the truth speak louder than the volume in the room. She spoke about ordinary Americans, people far outside the echo chambers, of Washington, who were watching this unfold and beginning to understand that the rules no longer applied equally. That if you stand on the wrong side of the aisle, your rights can be ignored, your voice can be silenced, your life can be dismantled, piece by piece, and no one in power will lift a finger to stop it. That's not democracy, she said. That's coercion. And then she said what no one else in the room had the courage to admit. The real target wasn't the man they kept naming in their speeches. It was the movement behind him. The millions of Americans who dared to think differently, who challenged the mainstream narrative, who believed in the rule of law, the Constitution, and their God-given freedoms. This hearing, she argued, was a test balloon to see just how far they could push the envelope. If they could get away with twisting the law in this high-profile case, what was stopping them from doing it again, and again, and again? She reminded the panel and the country that history is filled with moments where governments turned on their own people under the guise of justice, where laws were weaponized, courts were manipulated, and dissenters were punished simply for existing outside the approved ideology. That was the trajectory she saw in these proceedings, and she wasn't afraid to call it out. Because silence, she said, would only speed the decline. Pam stood not just for one person under fire, but for every American who has felt the slow erosion of their rights over the last few years. She spoke for the families who lost businesses, to arbitrary shutdowns, for students silenced in classrooms, for workers fired for refusing to comply with mandates, for citizens labeled extremists simply for asking questions. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system being recalibrated, not for freedom, but for obedience. She didn't mince words. She told them that the people watching from home knew exactly what was happening. They could feel it in their gut. The fear, the manipulation, the targeting. This wasn't justice. It was a message, a declaration that if you stand in the way, they will come for you. Maybe not with handcuffs, but with IRS audits, with social media bans, with character assassinations, with knock after knock on the doors of those who once believed they were free to speak, vote, and live without fear of political retaliation. Pam made it clear. The public is not stupid. They know when something stinks. They can tell the difference between fairness and a witch hunt. And the more these power games continue, the more people will wake up. Because no matter how loud the media shouts, Pam Bondi sat quietly through the opening statements, but anyone watching her closely could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Her patience had limits, and those limits were being tested with every word that came from across the aisle. Then came the moment that broke the dam. Jasmine Crockett, with her confident tone and performative outrage, launched into a tirade, calling out alleged crimes, throwing around accusations like confetti at a political parade. It was a speech, not grounded in law or evidence, but in theater and emotion, designed for sound bites and social media, not for the solemn responsibility of governance. But what Crockett didn't expect was the force that came next. Pam Bondi didn't just respond, she delivered a calculated, piercing dismantling of every accusation thrown. She didn't raise her voice to match Crockett's theatrics. She didn't need to. What she brought was something far more powerful: command of the facts, legal clarity, and a moral authority that couldn't be faked. Her voice was steady but sharp, slicing through the noise like a razor. The contrast was undeniable. Crockett had lit the match, but Bondi brought a firestorm that no one in the room was ready for. She began by calmly outlining the timeline of events that had been completely distorted. While others shouted, she grounded the discussion in documented facts, pointing to prior investigations, testimonies, and official records that contradicted the narrative being pushed. She reminded the chamber that no one, no matter how passionate or loud, gets to rewrite history. She exposed how key evidence had been ignored or cherry-picked to support a predetermined outcome, not to pursue truth, but to push a political vendetta. As she spoke, the room changed. Even those who disagreed with her had to shift in their seats. Bondi had seized control not by attacking personalities, but by demolishing the foundation of the argument. She highlighted contradictions, inconsistencies, and outright misinformation that had gone unchecked for too long. She didn't just push back. She revealed the entire narrative as hollow, built more on emotion than law, more on speculation than substance. Every line she delivered was precise. She questioned why, if the evidence was so compelling, it had to be accompanied by such dramatic posturing. She asked what kind of justice required misrepresenting facts, ignoring precedent, and vilifying without due process. She challenged the motives behind the showy accusations, suggesting that it wasn't about accountability, it was about optics. It was about scoring political wins, not seeking legal truth. And that, she said plainly, was a betrayal of the trust the American people placed in that room. Her tone sharpened as she brought up what had been conveniently left out, the exculpatory information buried under a mountain of partisan outrage. She noted the refusal to acknowledge previous investigations that had found no wrongdoing, the way key testimonies had been taken out of context, and how the timeline had been manipulated to paint a darker picture than the facts could support. She didn't speculate or grandstand. She cited, she quoted. She laid out piece by piece the entire puzzle that had been hidden from public view. What made her response so powerful was not just the content, it was the control. Pam Bondi wasn't rattled. She wasn't baited by the theatrics. Instead, she looked across the room with a kind of disappointed clarity, as if to say, "You know better." And maybe some of them did. Because for all the noise and applause, on one side there was a creeping awareness spreading that what Bondi was saying couldn't be ignored. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. She ended her remarks with a devastating rhetorical question that hung in the air like smoke. If the process can be twisted this easily against one person, what protects anyone else from the same treatment? The question didn't need an answer. The silence in the room said enough. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about power, and the terrifying ways it was being used under the guise of justice. Jasmine Crockett had started her moment with fire, but what came back was a cold, relentless blaze of reason that burned through every flimsy argument. In trying to indict a single individual, she had triggered a response that put the entire process on trial. And Bondi had made it clear, if justice was going to be twisted into a weapon, then someone had to stand in its way, not with shouts. With truth, with law, and with the calm, unshakable courage to say what everyone else was afraid to admit. Pam Bondi didn't come to that congressional hearing to simply defend a person or a party. She came to defend something far greater. As she took the floor, it was clear her words carried the weight of a larger battle, a fight for the very foundation of the nation's principles. She spoke not just as a former attorney general, but as a guardian of the Constitution and as a voice for millions of Americans who felt the slow unraveling of their freedoms. The air in the room shifted, heavy with the gravity of what was at stake. This was no longer just a political dispute. It was a war for the soul of the country. Every phrase Bondi uttered was a call to arms. She reminded everyone watching that what was unfolding was not merely about individuals or scandals. It was about preserving the core values that have defined the nation for centuries: the rule of law, equal justice, and freedom of speech. Her tone was resolute, unapologetic, and unwavering, as if she was drawing a line in the sand that could not be crossed. She made it clear that the consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the chamber and the immediate headlines. She emphasized that the Constitution wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a living promise to every citizen that their rights would be protected, that due process would be honored, and that the law would be applied fairly and without bias. But what she saw being played out in those hearings was the exact opposite. It was a selective application of justice, where rules were bent, evidence was manipulated, and political expediency took precedence over fairness. This was a dangerous precedent, she warned, one that threatens the very fabric of the Republic. Pam Bondi spoke directly to the American people. She understood their frustration and fear. She gave voice to the countless individuals who have watched as institutions meant to protect them seem to turn against them instead. She reminded them that when justice is compromised, when legal processes become tools of political warfare, it's not just the accused who suffer, it's every citizen who depends on those institutions for fairness and protection. She made it clear that this erosion of trust affects everyone, from the smallest town to the biggest city. Her speech was more than a defense. It was a rallying cry. Bondi called on Americans to recognize the signs of a system under siege and to stand firm in defense of their rights. She warned that if the current path continued unchecked, it would open the door for arbitrary power to dominate and dissenting voices to be silenced. She made the case that this was not a partisan issue. It was a national emergency. The battle. Lines were drawn not by ideology, but by the commitment to uphold the principles that have made the nation strong. Throughout her remarks, Bondi's passion was evident, but so was her clarity. She didn't rely on rhetoric alone. She cited the Constitution, legal precedents, and the history of the Republic to underscore her points. She challenged her audience to think beyond the immediate political theater and to consider the long-term implications of allowing justice to be weaponized. Her words carried the weight of experience and conviction, making it impossible to dismiss her concerns as mere political posturing. She also warned of the chilling effect that such proceedings have on the public. When people see leaders subjected to endless investigations, public humiliation, and baseless accusations without clear evidence, it sends a message to all Americans: speak up at your own risk. This culture of fear, she explained, undermines the very democratic process that allows citizens to hold their leaders accountable. Instead of fostering transparency and trust, it breeds suspicion and division. Bondi's remarks resonated with a sense of urgency because she knows the stakes are high. The rule of law is not just a legal concept, it is the backbone of liberty. Without it, the government becomes unchecked and citizens become vulnerable. She reminded everyone that freedom is fragile and must be fiercely protected. The moment. The scales of justice tip toward favoritism or vendettas. The country moves away from democracy and toward something far darker. In standing up that day, Pam Bondi positioned herself not just as a defender of one person, but as a defender of all Americans' rights. She underscored the importance of holding fast to constitutional principles even when it's difficult or unpopular. Her voice carried the message that democracy depends on respect for due process, impartiality, and the presumption of innocence. These aren't just legal niceties, they are the pillars that ensure freedom and fairness for everyone. Her speech left no room for ambiguity. This was a defining moment, a crossroads where the nation could choose to uphold justice or to let it be subverted by politics. Pam Bondi made it clear where she stood. The battle wasn't just about who's right or wrong in a single case. It was about whether the rule of law would survive the pressures of the day. And in that battle, she stood firm, unwavering, ready to defend the Republic with every ounce of strength she had. In the charged atmosphere of that hearing room, Pam Bondi's words echoed far beyond the immediate dispute. She made it clear that this moment was not just about one person or one political faction. It was a pivotal juncture for the entire nation. The principles that underpin the country's identity, the rule of law, fairness, due process, and equal justice, were on trial, and their preservation depended on more than just rhetoric. It required courage, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to truth above all else. Bondi reminded everyone watching that justice cannot be a tool wielded selectively to silence opposition or punish dissent. When legal proceedings become weaponized for political gain, the consequences ripple through every corner of society. It erodes trust in institutions, weakens the social fabric, and diminishes the rights that generations fought to secure. Her voice carried the weight of those lessons learned through history, the warnings written in the scars of past abuses of power that turned justice into a farce. She also spoke directly to the American people, who often find themselves caught between competing narratives and the constant churn of media spin. Bondi urged citizens not to lose faith, but to remain vigilant, to demand transparency, to insist on evidence over emotion, and to hold leaders accountable without sacrificing the principles that safeguard liberty. The challenge, she said, is not to be swayed by the loudest voices or the most sensational headlines, but to seek the truth with an open mind and a steadfast heart. Her remarks served as a reminder that freedom is not guaranteed. It is earned and protected daily by those willing to stand up against injustice wherever it appears. The preservation of constitutional values requires active participation from all Americans, not passive acceptance of whatever narrative is convenient. Pam Bondi's stance was a call for collective responsibility, urging people to engage, to question, and to defend the legal framework that allows democracy to thrive. Ultimately, her speech was a testament to the enduring strength of the rule of law when championed by principled individuals. It was a call to reject the politicization of justice and to restore faith in a system that must serve all citizens equally. In challenging the theatrics and the spectacle, she invited a return to sober, deliberate governance grounded in facts and fairness. This moment was more than a confrontation in a hearing room. It was a crossroads for the nation's future. The path chosen now will shape how justice is perceived and practiced for years to come. Pam Bondi's unwavering defense of constitutional principles stood as a beacon, reminding everyone that the fight for truth and fairness is ongoing and demands courage from all who cherish freedom. In a time when division and discord threaten to erode the very institutions that protect liberty, her message was clear. Justice must remain blind, impartial, and above political games. Only then can the nation heal, grow, stronger, and continue to fulfill the promise of equality under the law for every citizen, regardless of politics